Okay, so today we're at the Jolt Call Conference 2014 in Nagoya, Japan, and we're joined by Dr. Glenn Stockwell. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Fresh from your plenary, very enjoyable plenary, thank you.
Thank you.
Can you introduce yourself for the audience? Tell us a little bit about
Yes, my name is Glenn Stockwell, as you so kindly introduced me. I'm originally Australian. I did my BA at the University of Queensland in Languages and Linguistics. I did an MA in Applied Linguistics at Bond University in Australia. Did a Master of Education in Second Language Teaching at the University of Southern Queensland, and after that then I did my PhD in Computer Assisted Language Learning at the University of Queensland. So I've been in the field of call and language teaching for quite a long time.
Yes.
And I'm currently a professor at in the School of Law at Waseda University in Tokyo.
Okay. You're quite well known as, well, internationally I think, but also here in Japan as with your involvement with the Jolt Call special interest group.
Yes.
And especially with the journal.
Yes.
Can you tell us a little bit about the journal?
The journal, in 2004, I joined the Jolt Call SIG in 2002. I arrived in Japan, I took a position in Japan in 2001, and I became active in the call SIG from 2002. And we had a newsletter at the time, which was good, but we were kind of always struggling for publications, and from 2003 I started up as the co-editor of the newsletter. But when I was looking at the conferences, and I thought, we've got so much potential talent here that it seems a waste to only have a newsletter. So in 2004 at the Jolt Call SIG AGM, I proposed that we have a journal, and we make an international refereed journal. And it was approved at the AGM, and from 2005 we started up with myself as the editor-in-chief, with an editorial board of around 10 members, and that was the beginnings. We're now into our 10th issue, just this year, we're volume 10, sorry, so it's been 10 years since we started, and now we have, apart from myself, we have 3 associate editors from 3 different continents. We have our international review board is representing pretty much most of the world as far as regionally, and the journal is indexed now in many of the well-known indexes.
The published articles are coming from not just Japan but across Asia and all around the world, right? Japan
would make up probably about 30%. And the rest are from really everywhere. We've had the UK, we've had the US, we've had Australia, New Zealand, Sweden, Germany, Luxembourg, Iran, China, Taiwan, Korea. We've had from all over the world.
And it's open access now?
It is, yes. When we first started, we had it in paper version with a delayed online version. So the paper version went out to the members. That was kind of the carryover from the newsletter. And we waited for 12 months before we made the online version available. But I started receiving so many requests from people to get articles that were listed there, then the associate editors and I decided, let's just make it open access. So the members still receive a paper version of it, whereas anyone else in the world can access it online for free at the same time as the paper version comes out.
It's a great resource, so anyone who's interested, get on Google and go and find it.
You find it's not too hard to find?
Yes, thank you. Okay, well, let's look at some of the themes from your plenary today. So you started off talking about why or whether call is still a valid name for the field.
Yes.
And you mentioned the article from, is it Mike Levy?
Yeah, and Phil Hubbard.
Why call?
Yes.
So why call?
It's an ongoing discussion. It's been around really for a very long time. This discussion is far from a new discussion. It was actually first raised in 1997 by, I think it was Bush was the person who brought it up initially, and at that time he didn't refer to call, he referred to the field as tell. So it's certainly not a new discussion, But when we're referring to technology, I still believe we're referring to a particular type of technology. And in the past, while that really was computers, and be that in desktop or laptop form, when we're talking about mobile phones and tablets and other communication devices like this, these have a processor inside them. And I think we can refer to these still as computers. I mean, they're shrunk down computers with different interfaces. It's no longer just the keyboard or the mouse. Now we have pen input, we have oral input, we have different forms of input which makes the interaction different, but they're still a type of computer. The use of call, it's established. To take the title which has been around now for 30 years at least, and certainly for well-known journals, it's in the titles of well-known journals. We've got the Call Journal, we have Recall Journal, we've got the Just Call Journal. Using call, it's not easy to change the name and maintain the name value of the journal. So I think there's a place for the name call still. I think we can identify with that. There's a certain credibility associated with the name. Will that always be the case? Possibly not. But at the very least, I don't see a pressing need at the moment to change this without thinking the full implications.
Changing the name of the field would not necessarily change what we're doing.
That's right. I think it would not change anything. Just because we've changed it to technology doesn't mean that we'd use different technologies from what we would be using anyway.
TEL is technology enhanced. Yeah.
It's actually TEL and TAL came up at the same time.
Yeah.
And TAL kind of didn't really have any other sort of connotations, whereas TEL was the idea of communicating. In the same way that call. When I first started in the field, the word cell was still common, and that was back in 1993. And some people were using cell then, but cell rather quickly was replaced broadly by call. And I think if there was to be anything, it would be TEL rather than TAL. Kind of like similar kind of idea behind.
I think it's got a bit more traction. Okay, then we went on to talk about a couple of difficulties for teachers who are looking at using technology. The first was choosing what for which purpose. So how teachers go about selecting technology. And you were quite keen to stress that we should approach it usually from a pedagogy first perspective, of course.
Yes.
And you wrote about that in 2007, well, and other times too, I'm sure, but I was looking at a particular article. So what are your conclusions? What do you think teachers do when they're trying to choose technology for purposes?
We see different fashions and trends in call. It's probably not that surprising, because when technologies come out, then they really replace the way that we think about many things. But we have some people who will be quick to adopt a new technology without thinking of the full range of implications which come with this technology. It's cool. It's really, they want to be the first person to publish in that particular field, and maybe they establish a name for themselves in that way. We saw in conferences back in maybe about 2008, we could see that Moodles were maybe made up about a third to 40% perhaps of the presentations at the conference. Moodles are no less effective than what they were then. I mean, still they're great, but
this is the hype cycle that you were referring to, right?
Yeah.
The peak of inflated expectations.
That's right. Yes, people kind of believe that something's going to work, so they quickly pick it up, and then they go with perhaps inflated expectations, and they find that it didn't quite happen the way that they hoped. So then we have this crash where we see this disillusionment, and perhaps as much as the expectations were exaggerated. Often the disillusionment's also exaggerated.
Well, I think that's often a good time to pick up a technology, because a lot of other people have done the failure, and then the developers of a particular technology have probably gone back and it's a second or third iteration of it, and that's the time when it may be working better, perhaps.
Well, what usually happens at that time is that we've had a chance to see it in use. In one sense, this trying out new technologies is inevitable. We need to try them out to see whether or not they are applicable. That doesn't mean that we do that in lieu of good pedagogy. We still need to know how we're going to use it in a sound pedagogical manner. But at the same time, if we don't start first of all with seeing how the technology can be used and then see what works and doesn't work, that is valuable information for us to use it more effectively in the future. But when people see failures or see the technologies not being picked up with the same enthusiasm that they had, then they tend to get disillusioned, and some people will separate from it completely. And I think that's premature, because it's from that point, this is when we start studying pedagogy. This is when we start seeing how it can be used. And Mike Levy and I wrote about this in 2006 in our Core Dimensions book, that we have what we call emergent technologies and established technologies. And the emergent technologies are when the new technologies come out. We have a rush to use them. But the pedagogy surrounding emergent technologies tends to be less mature. It's when we've seen a technology used for a while, so the established technologies come into place, this is when we can start to really see how they can be used based on solid pedagogical principles.
Would you say this cycle has some relationship to the theory of normalization that Stephen Bax talks about? In
one way, I like the idea of having technologies not so obvious to us. I mean, Stephen Bax, when he talked about this, he said that we'd no longer notice it. And in his early work, he said that we'd eventually, that if our technologies became so normalised, there'd be no need for us anymore. He's revised his view since then. But I understand what he's trying to say. I don't think he meant that quite in the way that it was picked up upon. But when we use a technology, even if it's normalised, even if it's not noticeable, it still makes a difference. So Mike Levy wrote in 2000 how the technologies will always make a difference. And I really strongly agree with him on that point. Technologies will always make a difference. But the fact that technologies will always make a difference doesn't necessarily mean that they can't be normalised. If we look at our word processors now, we write papers in a completely different way from the way that we did. We wouldn't dream of going back to handwriting papers, but they make an impact. They change the way that we do things. So something being normalised doesn't mean that it doesn't make a difference. I think these two ideas can, and they do, coexist.
That makes perfect sense, I think. Although, as you say, initially it seems a little counterintuitive, but yeah, it's a clear concept, I think. I like the term that you used, talking about theory shopping. Sometimes we see research or presentations or publications where it seems that the teacher has chosen a technology first and then tried to find a reason for using it. You did actually stress that this isn't always a bad thing. We kind of call these more practice-driven, which is not necessarily to its detriment. But what can you enlarge a little bit on the idea of theory shopping and how it works?
In a lot of cases, I think that as teachers, I think a lot of people who will adopt a technology do have ideas of how to teach. They have their own inherent teaching methodologies, and they do have views about the way the language is learned. And when they adopt a technology, then this is usually evident in their approaches. But these are often not based upon what we would say acknowledged or accepted theories per se, but a learning idea or a learning approach or teaching approach which is in the mind of the person who's using the technology. And as you pointed out, that's not necessarily a bad thing. I think we need to go through that step. But at the same time, that the field of call, in order to mature, that we need to make sure that we are aware of theories. We need to be thinking about the applicability of theories. There are long established theories in second language acquisition. I don't think we can ignore those. There are other learning theories. I mean, we've got sociocultural theory, we have activity theory, which are related to language learning, but they have other elements involved in them as well. And these are very definitely included in what we do with learning a language. But if we ignore these theories that people have spent such a long time developing, then I think it's to our detriment. It shows us as perhaps not being aware of what's been done before, when perhaps we are.
This was one of the principles that you outlined for us at near the end of your talk, and one of them was that we need to be aware of and study the body of literature, and you pointed out that there do tend to be a lot of pilot studies and not so many follow-up studies or replication studies, and it actually makes things harder for us as teachers and researchers, because a lot of people have done a lot of good work, and we should...
We tend to reinvent the wheel in a lot of cases, which is a bit unfortunate. Maybe some people feel that a replication study is not original enough. So when they engage in replication studies, then maybe it's not interesting to the researcher. They got tired at the point of the pilot study, so they feel that there's nothing more to say. But the field can benefit a lot from replication studies. We need to follow up more on what's being done.
Do you think call as a field in particular suffers from obsession is perhaps too strong a word, but obsession with the new and the fresh, and which means that we don't look back as much as we should? And
There
if
is
you
a bit
think
of
of
that,
an article that comes from 2000 or 1996, well, it must be old hat because things have changed.
There is a bit of that. This is, I think, from researchers, but I'd say that there are perhaps even some journals that are guilty of this as well. That some reviewers may say that this is no longer relevant because it's an old reference. But there are some references that are from the 90s and even from before that, which are still very relevant to what we're doing today. I think maybe we believe that if something isn't new, then it's not going to be impactful enough. And there are certain things where we need to be aware of the latest things, the latest technologies, and how to apply these latest technologies as well. Our learners, for example, if we use an old chat system which doesn't include things like stickers or stamps or emoticons, then our students are going to find it rather boring because they have a different expectation. So there is a side where we need to, at the very least, keep that in mind. But at the same time, I think we're ignoring a lot of the foundations which have already been laid. And of course, I can't say that everybody's doing this, but there tends to be a little bit of that trend, which is to our detriment in the long term.
So let's come to one of the key points that you discussed, to finish up in a way. You talked about some of the emerging directions, and as you pointed out, it's a very dangerous game to predict the future, and you gave us a couple of interesting examples about, from 1970, Marvin Minsky said that we would have artificial intelligence, or we could use computers that way, which clearly haven't come true. But with that in mind, a couple of things you mentioned were the learner responsibility would increase, and also there would be more expectation on learners to become autonomous.
This is, I think, there is a push towards MOOCs at the moment. So we're seeing these massively open online courses, which are massive open online courses, which are encouraging exactly that, massive numbers of people to enrol. This is...
Enrolled is the key word, right?
It is enrolled. It's...
I've started many MOOCs.
Well, it's kind of like well, there you go. People do start in them, but they're unlikely to finish them off. And that actually links to the point that I did make in the presentation. That's about autonomy. That when we're in a classroom situation, a lot of people don't like talking about motivation, particularly Gardner and Lambert's instrumental integrative motivation, but I still think that there's a little bit of truth behind that, that we can bear in mind, and the fact that whether we're self-motivated to do something or we need extrinsic motivation, that those external forces to help us to do things. I mean, I know that if I didn't have tests, I wouldn't have studied. And if we don't have a very strong desire to do something, autonomy is something that a lot of people will expect goes hand in hand with mobile technologies or with using technologies, even in general sometimes, but they're very separate from one another.
Yes.
Autonomy is a skill that takes time to develop. Some people are autonomous from the beginning. They know they're motivated enough to look for things by themselves, and they have the skills to do that. Motivation and autonomy often come hand in hand, because if you're not motivated, it's difficult to be autonomous. They're not the same thing though. You can be motivated to do something and have no idea how to do it, which means that you're not autonomous. You still need to have help. At the same time, that telling somebody how to do something, or requiring someone to do something outside of class time, and say, bring this back to class next time, even though it's done out of class, it's not autonomous.
Yes.
Because there's still a requirement on that.
Yeah.
So when I was talking about the emerging directions, I think where we're seeing courses that expect learners to take responsibility for their own learning, and in the opposite side, when we see learners who believe that there's no need for formal learning because they can just pick up Google and find anything that they want anyway. This is perhaps this shared, I wouldn't say expectation, but there's a shared view that perhaps formalized learning situations are going to change. But are we ready for that? Is a concern that sticks around in my mind. And by ready, I mean, as teachers, are we willing to hand over the reins to the students to take responsibility for themselves? Are the learners ready to take the reins by themselves? Perhaps not.
Well, that brings me actually to the final question then, I think. And this one, this is something I've had an interest in for quite a long time. But you talked about dealing with the change and the knowledge of the available technology on both the side of the learner and the teacher. And you alluded to, or you mentioned the fact that there's a complex relationship between different levels of expectation. And of course, not so long ago there was a big kind of buzzword around the digital immigrant, digital native, and the assumption that teachers know less than their students about technology, which has come to be disproven or proved to be different. Can you tell us a little bit about your perception of how teachers and learners' understandings of technology differ?
Well, I think probably to sum up, maybe it's oversimplifying it in one sense, but perhaps our students know how to use the technologies for their own personal purposes.
Yes.
But personal purposes is very different from learning purposes. As teachers, although we may or may not be as competent as our learners with the technology for personal purposes, at the very least we should be skilled or know how to impart that knowledge of how to use a device for learning purposes. And the only way to do that is to include a very central training element. Not only showing the students what the technologies are, which is as Phil Hubbard and Ken Romeo talked about, this is what they refer to as technical training. But we often see this technical training coming at the beginning and once, maybe twice. So we have telling the learners what they are, but also showing how to use them for learning purposes, which is our strategical training. And then on top of that, then we have our strategic training. Then we have our pedagogical training, which is why we use them. So you've got the what, the how, and the why coming together. But this has to be done on an ongoing basis. We usually don't know how to do it in one go. It needs to be something which is taken over time and has time to mature. So the expectations, the differences between teachers and learners are not only at the technical level. It's very definitely at that level of knowing how and why to use that for specific learning purposes.
Well, we have a lot of challenges, but I guess we also have a lot of opportunities.
We do, yes.
So, thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you. Thank you very much.